ahead and begin. Are you good with that?
Yeah, of course.
So it's 2:01, and so we're so glad that you are here today. Some of you have already kind of talked to. This is not your first Parlor Talk this year, or maybe it is your first Parlor Talk this year, but it hasn't been your first Parlor Talk ever, and some people are new. So we're glad for all of you to be here. This year, or this summer, our focus has been on change. Change that we've started to see in our first Parlor Talk this year, or this summer, focused on the changes in the seafood industry. And we will end this next week, next Thursday at the same time, same place, but your chair might be in a different room. You never know, so come and find out. That will be the changes that Harper's Island has seen. So today what we're going to talk about is the changes with the tide and with flooding. And so we have Katherine here with us today. She has her PhD. So Katherine Anarde is a PhD professor at NC State University, and she's a coastal engineer. And one of the projects that she's really passionate about and is the Sunny Day Flooding Project, which means flooding when it's a sunny day. And she's going to tell you a little bit about that today and possibly some other things about just flooding in general. What I think we'll do, I did not ask Katherine, but we'll probably just let her kind of talk. If you have some questions, would you like them at the end or as you're going through the slides?
I was told it was conversational.
Perfect.
So, yeah, please interject.
So just ask questions because she's here for you to learn and for us to learn a lot more about the changes in the tide. So thank you, Katherine, for being with us today.
And I'm here to learn as well. I am a professor, and so I'm used to a slide deck, and Karen gave me the option of slides or no slides, so of course I went with slides. But I really do want to hear from you as we go through this slide deck. And the title of my talk for today is It's Flooding More Than We Know. And who is we? We is the academic community, the science community. So it is flooding more than we as scientists have recognized, but maybe not you as people that live in Carteret County recognize. So I'm really curious as I show you some numbers today on how often it's flooding in Carteret County to get your feedback. Is this eye-opening? Is it a low ball in terms of the numbers? Let me know. So I co-lead a project called the Sunny Day Flooding Project. My co-leader is Miyuki Hino. She's also a professor, but at UNC Chapel Hill. So a lot of this work stems from UNC, and our electrical engineers are local at UNC IMS. I actually went and dropped off a sensor just before this. So a lot of this work is just around the corner. And she's a social scientist in urban planning. So today I'm talking about flooding. It's flooding more than we know. But I'm not talking about the hurricane-driven floods or the nor'easter-driven floods. I'm talking about the frequent, shallow floods that happen on Front Street in Beaufort, happen here in Moorhead. But really they've been popularized across the nation, across the globe, in these more urban settings, like in New York City and San Francisco and Norfolk and Honolulu. They go by a lot of names. King tide flooding, sunny day flooding, high tide flooding, but they all stem from sea level rise. So as sea levels propagate higher and higher, tides can propagate higher and higher on top of those sea levels and flood low-lying areas. So how we measure these floods, or how we have measured them historically, is through tide gauges, like the one here in Beaufort. So tide gauges are over marine water bodies, and we use these water levels to infer flooding on land. What I'm showing here is a little schematic where the tide gauge is detecting a higher water level than a threshold that was developed, and that higher water level in the bay coincides with the elevation of the flood on the road. So in this little schematic, the water comes up through a stormwater outlet and out onto roadways. And this is one type of flooding that we see here locally down in Beaufort. So, tide gauges are not intended to capture flooding on land. They are intended to look at changes in water levels in marine water bodies. They are for the tides, not for floods. They're not called flood gauges. So we know that during, for example, a rainstorm, if maybe some of the stormwater outlet is submerged at a mid-tide, at a low tide, and just a little bit of rainfall overwhelms the street, we can get flooding in the roadway that is not detected at the gauge. So our gauge is underestimating, by design, how many floods are occurring on land. But this is the best that we've got. So this is what we use nationally to gauge how well or how often it's flooding across the US. And the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration puts out projections for how many times it's going to flood in different regions at each tide gauge on this website. It's called the Monthly High Tide Flooding Outlook. So you can go and look at all the tide gauges for the Southeast and see if there's predicted flooding in your area based on the tide gauges alone. But we know that those tide gauges can only capture so much flooding. They are not capturing these land-based sources like rainfall. So what I'm showing here is a GIF from Carolina Beach from a camera that we mounted to a pole that shows one of these compound events where we have a rainstorm that coincides with, at this point, a high tide and leads to significant flooding in the roadway and toppling over of garbage cans. So what we've been working in this project for the past couple of years is to try to understand how often it's flooding. Is it flooding more than the tide gauges suggest? If so, how much? And how does that vary as you get away from the tide gauges, which are really sparse? How is it impacting people? Is it just garbage collection? Is it disrupting commutes to work, school buses? Are there human health impacts? And then what is the actual burden on communities and municipalities overall, fiscally, in terms of lost time? What is the burden? So I threw out a ton of names for these floods, right? Sunny day, king tide, nuisance, and that suggests that we don't really know what to call them. There are so many factors that are contributing locally to these floods that we're having a hard time pinning down a name. So they're hyper-local, meaning that one block can be flooding and another block down the road may not be flooding. And that's because we can have a ton of different drivers. Tides, winds here, blowing out different directions, can move water around. Let's say down east, you might have wind blowing out of the northeast that affects one community and 2 miles away, it's not affecting the other one. So wind, river, groundwater, stormwater infrastructure, rainfall, they're all contributing.
Driving out Highway 70 towards North River Bridge, there's a yellow diamond sign that says high water. It struck me that we should probably say low road.
Yeah, low road, that's a good point. Definitely low now, right? Like when it was built, maybe it was a medium road. But yeah, for sure now it's low. So we've got low roads all over the place here. That's a fact. So how often is it flooding? Well, all we've had is the tide gauges to give us an estimate. What we wanted to do as part of this project was fill in the gaps between tide gauges and actually measure floods on land. So what we did here in Beaufort, this is where we started in Beaufort, we put a sensor in the bottom of the drain and we measured how often the drain was full from water, and we call these the sunny day flood sensors because that's what we thought that we were measuring was just sunny day floods or high tide floods. But what we found, and this is a little preamble to the next few slides, is that rain is really important here in Beaufort. So fortunately, the sensor that we designed also captures these land-based factors like rain and groundwater. So we've had these sensors installed in Beaufort since 2021, so 3 years. We are now in 5 communities total, so Beaufort, down East Carteret County, which several communities, Carolina Beach, New Bern, I think that's it. And we're looking at a couple other locations across the state.
You know, we want to do this located.
There's 2 in New Bern. There's one at the park, because the town was really concerned about flooding from the river.
Lawson Creek or
Union Park? Yeah, Union Point. And then within a residential apartment complex that is located within a bowl, and the town was really concerned about flooding there. So all of our data are in real time. Yeah.
Is what do you call the gauge that's on the pole directly opposite Mescalito Front Street?
That's
Is that a flood gauge or a tide gauge?
That's a flood gauge. That's one of these.
Oh, yeah, because, well, when I scanned the card, it showed 1 in Beaufort and 4 down east.
Yep.
And so it's a flood gauge.
Yeah, it's one of these. It's one of my sensors. So we.
Where are the ones down east?
Let me jump ahead.
No, you can get to it.
Oh,
That's
no.
all right.
No, I'll show you. I can come back. I am actually PowerPoint savvy. Sometimes. Thank you. Okay. All right, so when you scan that QR code, it should take you to this website. And you can see Beaufort is right over here. Oh, I don't have the pointer. So Beaufort is down here.
Right,
And then we have the North River location.
right.
We have Davis, we have sea level, and then we have Cedar Island, on the way to Cedar Island. So these two were targeted because that's where NCDOT was really looking at. They wanted to see when access was impaired to down east for hazard communication purposes. These two were based on conversations with locals about where it flooded, flood hotspots, and then we're going to move this location in the next year down to Marshallburg.
Okay, good.
Yeah. So these are all real time. This just shows the locations, but there are images of the roadway. We blur out everything else. And
Is there a website we can access?
yeah, there is. It's downeastflooding.com.
Cool.
And that will take you to this view right here. And I can, do I have stickers in the car? I think I have stickers. I can give you guys stickers. Yeah, you can scan.
But you just said that there were other gauges in Beaufort. Well, what are those?
Oh, sorry, just the one. There are several gauges in Carteret County. There's one gauge in Beaufort.
The one at Mescalito.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if I can be PowerPoint savvy again. All right, so those are our gauges. I'm glad that you've seen the one here in Beaufort. This is one of the gauges in Carolina Beach. So this is my PhD student Thomas. He's showing the water level sensor that's underneath the drain. This looks pretty similar to the one that's here in Beaufort. So the drain is a bit bigger and maybe a bit cleaner. And then we have a camera that is usually located on a pole, and it's meant to help you guys to see if the roadway is accessible, and it helps us to ensure that we're getting good data.
So it's a two-part system.
Yeah.
Camera on the pole and then this thing in the ground.
Exactly. Yeah, we did that mostly for redundancy. A single data point in a storm drain is pretty hard. We get trash on that sensor, we get growth, we get eels.
Eels?
Yeah, found a dead eel wrapped around one time. Batteries are actually pretty good in this thing. Yeah, as long as it's working or communicating well, it transmits data in real time from underneath that big heavy grate to our camera system. And those batteries last for like 6 months. But you'll see us from time to time going and removing trash. Because it's real time, we can see when it's not working and we can go out there and repair it. Okay, so what have these sensors told us? Well, it's flooding way more on land than tide gauges suggest. Over the last year, so from April 7th, or really this is May 1st, 2023 to April 8th, 2024, I updated this slide. We saw 20 days with floods in Beaufort. In Carolina Beach, we saw 60 days. And in sea level, 122 days. What
do you define as a flood?
Exactly. A flood. Any amount of salt water on the road outside of an extreme event. So the extreme events that we removed were Ophelia, Idalia, the December nor'easter.
Ian?
I think that's it. Ian wasn't in 2023, right? Wasn't it Ophelia and Idalia?
Yeah.
I think just those two. And
Just maybe something that you
Yeah.
get to, but do you think the primary difference in these three, because like for example, sea level and both are very close to each other, is just elevation?
elevation and geography, like the shape of the coastline.
Oh.
So anyone in down east will tell you where to avoid out of a north, or when there's a northeast wind versus a southwest
So
wind.
some of this like can be wind driven.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's my big story. That's the big takeaway for today. Is that it's not just tides, it's wind and it's rain. So Beaufort is a lot higher and it's more developed. So we go from more urban with a larger stormwater network in Beaufort and more data. You guys have the tide gauge right here in Beaufort. And it's right next to our sensor location. You can almost see it. To all the way in sea level where you have very little flood data or data, tide gauge data. You've got the old gauge at Cedar Islands. The ditches where they still exist are pretty much filled in with marsh at this point. And of course it's more rural. Carolina Beach is kind of an in-between. There's stormwater infrastructure, but it's a lot more sparse.
Are you concerned with duration as well?
Yeah.
Are these just 6-hour events from flood, or a day and a half because of the wind?
Both. So I didn't include any of the duration, well, no, I didn't include the duration plots. Most of the data that I'm showing you today I actually showed to the Coastal Resources Commission. So this is what our state legislature saw. But we do have a paper coming out that shows durations for each of these locations. So average depths and durations. They can range for rainfall events from like 15 minutes, really flashy floods, to like 10 hours with the wind-driven floods. I think during Ophelia, again, the extreme storms were not included in this data set, but I want to say it was like 30 hours that this road was submerged in sea level. So that was pretty eye-opening to me.
Down east where I live, have the point in the North Leopard Creek. The first year I was here, only had 3 days, and they were just 8-day events that it flooded creek to creek. Second year, it was maybe 4 or 5 days. The third year, I had 4 or 5 days in a row, continuous. So it was, beyond 72 hours. The whole point was underwater, and it was definitely a nor'easter. That was driving that.
One of the goals of this project is to look over time. So we now have these sensors in place across the state, and we'll be doing this analysis. We have funding, I think, for the next 5 years at least to continue monitoring. So that, of course, there's annual variability in rains, right? If we have an El Nino or La Nina year. But if we get enough data, we should start to have good evidence of long-term trends.
The last 2 years, I've had 12 days or more. So
Really?
Up from 3 days to 7 years ago.
Huh. And you think that's mostly wind, or?
I think most of those events are wind driven, but I think part of this is sea level rise.
Yeah.
And we've also got subsidence. I've noticed I've got a little emerging ghost forest on the point. It just has occurred here in the last 7 years.
Yeah, that's something I haven't brought up yet, is subsidence, and especially in these marshy areas, you'll see land sinking. So I'm just going to highlight some of what we found through these sensors in each of these locations. And starting in Beaufort, where we have the longest time record, this is where we did our first analysis against tide gauges. So time series are boring, but you can see on the bottom right that the pink and the blue, there's 2 lines there. One is the water level that we measure with our sensor, and that's blue. And and the other one is with the tide gauge, and that's pink. So they're on top of each other. So the tide gauge here, when the floods were purely driven by marine water levels, did a really good job at capturing these events. But when a little bit of rain happened, the tide gauge didn't do a good job. And we can see this here. Our measured water level is black. You can see these big spikes. Those are our rain events. And you asked about how long these floods are. This one was small. It's just a couple inches. You can see on the right, there's some ripples on either side of the road. And it was very short. So I think single data point, 6 minutes. We sampled for 6 minutes. So what we found with that first sensor, and this is from a paper that we published back in 2023, was that about 25% of the flood events over a 6-month time period occurred on rainy days. So rain was really important here. And we couldn't pick up those rainy day events with the tide gauge, of course, because that's not what they were designed to do. They are not flood gauges. So if you want to take a look at more Beaufort data, you can head to that paper. I want to highlight some ongoing work in Carolina Beach where it's flooding more often than Beaufort. It is very low lying. It has some stormwater infrastructure where water comes up through the drains, and then water can also overtop low-lying shorelines. There's been a lot of community conversations about what to do about the flooding. The flooding during this last king tide on Sunday, I was out there sampling some water quality, and I was up to my knees in the road in some locations. And this was one of the smaller predicted king tides of the fall. So this is along Canal Drive, which is one of 2 roads to access a lot of these homes. This is also a big tourist destination, and a lot of the people that I talked to while I was there did not know what was going on. They thought maybe there was a water main leak. So here the conversation might be different with tourists, but a lot of people don't know what these floods are if they're just visiting, and they don't recognize that it's salt water. So the town is trying to figure out what to do about it. We built this model. It's a numerical model that can simulate the flooding. And this is the water propagating up through this undeveloped property that's just marsh. Most of these properties have bulkheads to stop water from entering their property. This is if it was just tides. Then we added some wind. This was a northeast wind. And once we added wind, we saw water go around the corner and all the way down Canal Drive. And this is what we see a lot in Carolina Beach, where water overtops low-lying shorelines and infills or travels down the street into our sensor locations. And since I've got the time, I'll show you a video of what this looks like, because it is quite a bit different than what we see up here. Let's see. Maybe not. Okay, well, there we go. Okay, so water comes down around the corner and can flood the roadway there. That's about 1.5 to 2 feet of water in the road.
Time frame, 30 minutes, an hour?
Let's see. That's 9:40. I want to say the road typically floods for 3 to 4 hours during a regular king tide event. Yeah, there you go. It's going back down by 11. So just some perspective of how the flooding looks in other parts of the state and what we're doing in these other locations. Oh, there, that was the joke I was looking for. Doing these other parts of the state. So there they have gates that close the road whenever there is predicted tidal flooding. So they have a local threshold that they use to close these gates to try to prevent people from driving through the saltwater, because the wakes can go into people's homes. It's also saltwater and can hurt cars. What we found for a period between April 2022 and 2023 is that 30% of the floods in Carolina Beach were unexpected by the community based on that tidal threshold. And that's again
largely because of wind and rain. And like I just showed you with that model, just a little bit of wind, 5 mile per hour winds out of the northeast over 24 hours can really pile up water in our Atlantic shelf and through tidal inlets and into bays. So we put out a survey in Carolina Beach asking questions about what the community would like to see to try to minimize flooding. And what I'm showing here is results from that survey, from strongly oppose on the left to strongly support on the right for 2 different flood mitigation or adaptation strategies. The one on the left is to remove infrastructure from areas that frequently flood and restore wetlands. We thought this would be vastly unpopular, but the percent of respondents is actually, results were neither strongly biased towards oppose or support. It was across the board. But there was large support within our survey respondents for installing stormwater pumps to move the water elsewhere. And there's lots of ideas out of the community about where to move the water. So we're working now to model some of these ideas that are driven by the community with municipal staff through some workshops. So this is a really targeted exercise about what to do about the problem.
You pump it, you have to pump a long way away to get it, just come right back in, right?
Yeah,
Yes,
there's a
so
lot of
we should-
ideas about where to pump
You
it.
can't just put it back in the center. It's
Right.
Taylor Creek.
Yeah. Well,
Miles of-
what we found so far, it really needs to be a combination. You have to increase bulkhead heights, put bulkheads really everywhere, which is illegal if there's marsh present. So you've got to stop the bay water from coming over the shorelines and then pump out of the road. And another problem that I haven't really talked about is groundwater. As sea level gets higher and higher, so does groundwater. And that can bubble up through roadway or on the side of roadways, infill ditches. I see it pop up a lot around electrical beams. So those poles puncture sand and allow water to come up. So you might keep an eye out for that in your neighborhood.
In Venice, Italy, they give the tourists a couple of garbage bags they can put on each leg and still walk through St. Mark's.
I'm not sure how far off we are from that, and you'll see that's perfect intro to what I'm about to talk about. So what are the impacts? We know that these floods impede traffic. We've got lots of statistics on that. There's been some research done around business revenues. What about water quality? We see these garbage cans, they're getting knocked over. We know that there's pet waste. We know there's septic tanks that are being inundated by higher groundwater levels. Carolina Beach has an underground sewage system that is pumped to higher ground. So what we've been looking at out of NC State, this is led by my colleagues Natalie Nelson and Angela Harris, who are both water quality experts. What we've been looking at is there contamination concern in these floodwaters due to exfiltrated sewage, so essentially broken sewer pipes. And what we found is, yes, there are concerns about contaminated water, both here in Beaufort, and we have a paper on that just came out a couple of months ago, but also in Carolina Beach. In Beaufort, which I'm not going to show the results today, we measured during smaller floods. So there's ponding around some of the storm drains, and the elevated concentrations of fecal indicator bacteria were above standards, which I'll talk about in the next slide. But there were concerns here in Beaufort, which might not be a new piece of knowledge for you guys. There have been sewage issues in downtown Beaufort in the past, but there remains concerns about water quality in these floodwaters.
What are the red and blue dots?
So this is where we sampled in Carolina Beach. We sampled for the marine indicator bacteria and Pterococcus, and those are our sample locations. Red are along the roadway, blue are in the bay. And these are our results. So we can't sample directly for E. coli. We sample for an indicator organism. It's called enterococci. And each of these names, periwinkle through sandpiper, they're cross sections. They're roadways, they're intersections. And the bars are the dates that we sampled last summer. The values in the bottom are in most probable number per 100 milliliters. This is just a volume estimate. So there are not regulatory standards for flood waters, for water quality. For shellfish, they go out and they measure bay water. There are standards for recreation in marine waters. There are no standards for floodwaters from the state, from the EPA. It's unregulated. So I'm just telling you that because I'm comparing these results to our recreational standards. That means if somebody from the state goes out and gets a water sample right here in Taylor's Creek, they would say, okay, is the enterococci an NPN per 100 milliliters greater than 100? If it is, we issue a warning. So this is a log axis in the bottom. So it's times 10 when you go past that red line. So you can see that our samples from the roadway are 10, 100 times the regulatory standard for fecal matter in the water. So these tidal floods are contaminated, but they're unregulated. So what do we do about it? Stay out of them. Put trash bags on your feet.
Yeah.
If you do interact with the floodwaters, wash your hands. If you see tourists playing in them, tell them to get out and wash their hands. So we created this exercise caution fact sheet. It's through NC State or NCC grant, which supported the work. So you can go to ncsu.edu/tidal floods, and it provides some suggestions on what to do if you interact with the floodwaters. But generally speaking, don't walk through them, don't play in them, don't recreate in them. Yeah.
Just a comment. My daughter attended the College of Charleston, South Carolina, and she says everybody down there has their Wellington boots up to their knees.
Yeah.
To take, because it floods so often.
I mean, that's great. Yeah, wear Wellingtons. When we sample, we wear
That's why it suits.
hazmat, not hazmat, but exactly, chest waders.
Yeah.
Saying that, we don't actually know if it will make people sick because it's unregulated and the research that needs to be done to confirm that contaminated water actually causes illness has not been done because this is a new phenomenon. But we're trying to do some of that work right now. And we're starting in Carolina Beach, but we're still sampling in the region, and we're starting to sample in Down East.
The enterococci is just a marker, is the hepatitis and all the other bad bugs.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an indicator bacteria. Yeah, exactly. So last but not least, we just started working Down East about a year ago. So in terms of what I have to show, I have the least amount to show, but we're developing a numerical model for Down East, similar to the one in Carolina Beach that can capture rainfall. We continue to monitor the roadways. We also already completed some surveys in Carteret County as part of the DEEP project. And this is some results from the DEEP surveys. So the share of respondents is on the left, and then what I'm showing here is the number of respondents that report disruptions to daily life from these floods. So these are not hurricane floods. So we see about 40% of the respondents, flooding actually occurs in their property outside of hurricanes. These floods disrupt their commutes to school or to work. About 40% say they disrupt their errands and social activities. So this was our first indication of how expansive the problem was in Carteret County. And that's a pretty large share of respondents that are reporting disruptions to their daily lives from these non-extreme storm floods.
When you move that North River Bridge sensor to Marshallburg, will that be at the point, the parking lot, or under the canopy there?
So I drove around with Karen and looked at potential places. I still haven't, I was thinking over towards the cemetery. So there's a side road off of Shell Hill Road that floods a lot, and it cuts off a couple people down that road. There's also, I wish I could zoom in.
There's a big house just across from the point, I think it's on Piper Lane. And I think that property in Piper Lane goes underwater further on too.
Okay. I'd also like to look, we're sampling for water quality too, and I'd like to strategically place sensors as well to support that work. So we're still talking to people in Marshallburg and seeing where the sensor might be most useful for the community and also support some of the science. Yeah.
How much of the flooding is due to barometric pressure?
Outside, not much. So
It
pressure.
seems like at least in hurricanes.
Yes, exactly.
It really drops, and it pulls up.
Yep.
Elevates the water pretty high.
Yep, for
So I didn't
exactly.
know where you started.
There are bulges sometimes that occur, at least I talked to Neil Sundquist at UNCIS frequently. They can start down between Florida and Bermuda, and it might be 3 or 4 feet high. It's just an elevation of the ocean level, and it will move right on up here.
There's certainly a lot of factors that influence the sea level in this region. Temperature is a big one. Circulation. So we see accelerated rates of sea level rise south of Hatteras right now, in large part because of the circulation patterns. So I'm not surprised to hear that. Those sorts of changes in sea level, some are seasonal. That's why we have such high water levels in the fall, in part because of the temperature, how hot the ocean gets over the summer. But some of those larger scale change or long time scales, you'll really see the sea level signature on a seasonal basis. Wind, rain are the big ones. And tides, the moon and the sun cycles. Okay. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to just talk to you guys about today. Land-based measurements are needed to capture these floods. Tide gauges are insufficient. Coastal residents are already feeling the burden of sea level rise through these floods. And the impacts can include a poor water quality. So just be vigilant about staying out of the floods, and if you see people playing, warn them of potential contamination hazards.
Is there is there an overall consensus about sea level rise and to what extent? I've seen stories recently that it seems to be rising faster than it had been anticipated 10 years ago or so.
Yeah, there are accelerations in this area. So south of Hatteras.
That brings up the other thing I was going to ask about.
Yeah.
This area. So there's like an impact depending on where you are on the globe as well. It's
Yes.
bulgier around the equator, but up further north there seems to be a substantial amount of sea level rise too. And then there are places sort of in between that don't seem to have as much impact. Do I have that?
You have that right. So globally, sea levels are rising, and that's due to melting of land-based ice and warming of the oceans, thermal expansion. So we have the global rate, but then we have relative changes. And that relative change, if we look back at the tide gauges in North Carolina, the rates of sea level that we're seeing at Duck are different than what we see down in Beaufort. And that's for a couple of reasons. Land sinking is one of them. Another one is that circulation with the Gulf Stream. So that those changes in ocean temperature have a big impact on sea levels locally. So that's why you see some areas that are rising faster than others. And then there are a lot more complicated ingredients over like climate 20, 30-year cycles that can play a role too.
Well, also, I guess the weather folks can get pretty excited about this. It seems that North Atlantic is running substantially hotter right now than it ever has. And I saw one of them say we've never seen temperatures at this time of year reach this level in the North Atlantic.
Yeah.
So the deep water ocean circulation is getting all confused. Matter of fact, there've been a couple of papers published this year suggesting that it might just stop.
Yeah, I've seen some.
The science that there will continue to be accelerations in sea level locally in this region to a point, and what we currently understand is that there are climate cycles that several decades into the future will switch and the accelerations will be less intense. So there will still be the global sea level rise, but the relative cycles will reduce that acceleration. But within our timescales of mortgages, you can expect that sea levels locally will continue to accelerate for the next several decades. So when we think about sea level rise in this region, and I wish I had a better plot than this for you, but this is the low emission scenario on the left, and then we have the high emission scenario on the right. We can still use these estimates through 2100 for sea level rise, and it's going to be somewhere in between. What we use right now is a best case is the intermediate within my research group. So this is the number of high tide flood days per year for the different sea level rise rate scenarios. So we're seeing a handful of high tide flooding days at the tide gauge now in the 2020s, but by 2060, which is not that far off, we're seeing upwards of 100 plus. And again, that's not including groundwater and rain.
Let things clear, getting flood insurance in this area is going to continue to get more and more difficult and more expensive if you get it at all.
Yeah, I live in Wilmington, I feel that too. Yeah, but the uncertainty in sea level rise is captured here, or the rate of sea level rise, but we can be sure at the low end, where it's really just like a linear projection here, on the high end, no matter what, we're seeing an increase in the number of flood days just based on the marine water levels. And again, we're really under capturing these counts based on rainfall in this area, and then wind and down east.
I know the pond, it's only 18 inches deep in the middle of my garden, and so it's primarily fed by groundwater, although anytime we have high tides or king tides or spring tides, it will flood, little fish will swim in from the creek. But if we don't have rain for 10 days or 2 weeks, that little pond will dry up, and I find myself watering the fish. So before we had the rain from Beryl a couple of weeks ago, I was watering the fish every day.
Well,
that's one impact of climate change.
how about places like Porcelain Valley that is sunk from PCS phosphate stuck to the ground?
Yeah.
And that may impact your Cedar Hollow measurement.
Oh, you're thinking with subsidence up at that location?
Yes, enormous amounts of groundwater pumped out to keep the pits dry.
I didn't know that. That's good to know.
Where do they put it?
Back in the river.
Huh.
But it pulls out, so that way it's.
Yeah.
So far we have not seen flooding on that road. I've anecdotally heard from folks that road only really goes under during extreme storms, but that may change in the next
Balance,
decade.
I grew up in New York. The Trent River has been 55 years, and it's at least 6 inches higher than the docks. So,
We really can take out tide influences in Newbern anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
If most of what we get is wind driven and rain and storm, it's kind of a strange irony that the northeast wind, which you would look at in town and seeing it blowing us down the river, is what actually forces the river up, because it comes in at a hook in the map and then pushes the water all the way up from down east all the way up to Newbern.
Yeah.
So
It's this regional scale.
we flood on a northeast wind.
Yeah.
And south northwest wind actually blows it out.
We didn't include Newbern in this presentation because it is such a different environment in terms of what drives it. So we just thought it would complicate the message to the CRC.
You're welcome.
I've heard that there's some concern about permits for fishing in Newbern because the saltwater lens is coming farther and farther up the river. Have you guys heard that? No?
We're kind of banned fishing.
So there's different permits for freshwater versus saltwater fishing, and I guess the lens has moved up the river quite a bit, and the boundary used to be at the bridge near Newbern, but now you're starting to
Well, it
see,
changes at different times of year too. So
Yeah.
it doesn't move up.
yeah, I guess the average is what they're concerned about.
The alligators do it
Yeah.
different. We have quite a few of those.
Demonstration site that I've been visiting up North River. It's about, I think, 4 miles north of North Island. It's healthy air. I was there a week ago at super low tide, and it was the lowest I'd seen. So I had to walk out 10 or 15 feet even to get into 2 or 3 inches of water. And when I took a salinity sample, it showed up 0. And I thought my refractometer was broken.
Yeah.
But it was because we had had some recent rain,
Yep.
and because it was so low, the fresh water floats on top.
Yep.
I measured it today, it was 24.
We had the same problem when we sampled on Sunday. We were doing the water quality. We thought our measurements, our connectivity meter was broken, but it turns out it's all the runoff from Cape Fear. Yeah. It's all fresh water.
Yes, the NC Coast is at the confluence of the cold Labrador and the warmer Gulf Stream. And could you comment on that, please? Does it have any effect at all on all of this?
Yes.
That confluence.
Yeah, so just the strength of the Gulf Stream has an influence on sea levels locally. So when we were talking about the acceleration in sea levels around Cape Hatteras, a lot of that has to do with where the Gulf Stream, or how it hugs and then goes off the North Carolina coast right there. So there's been some science that has said the Gulf Stream might slow down. There's been other papers that have come out that said that's not necessarily true. There's uncertainty there. And then there's the recent papers that I mentioned that say that this acceleration that we're seeing right now, that's really unprecedented over the last decade, that's actually a cycle that's going to eventually, several decades from now, come back down. And that's largely related to these big atmospheric ocean interactions that influence the Gulf Stream and the Labrador.
So the closer the Gulf Stream comes to the coast, the higher the water.
It influences the movement of warm water locally, and the warmer the water, the thermal expansion, that increases sea level.
You hit the news this summer about a herd of manatees that was spotted swimming up the intercoastal waterway. And apparently it's become more common over the last 4 or 5 years. I was telling this story to the post office lady at the Smyrna post office, and she said, yeah, everybody wants to come visit the Cape. Now, up in Maine, lobsters are all moving up to Newfoundland. It's just destroyed the lobstering industry up there.
Yeah.
Because the water's just gotten too warm.
Yeah.
What's the Labrador current that's cold?
Well, apparently it's further offshore.
Oh.
And again, globally, sea levels are increasing in temperature too. So it's not just the loop currents that matter, it's also the global temperature.
And the Labrador current will still be cold, it just wouldn't be as cold as it was. The
Yeah.
lobsters are very sensitive to
Few degrees of move.
Yeah. There, I mean, talk to the fishing industry around here, and just the last several decades and changes in fishing, or what's actually offshore. There was a talk at Core Sound that I went to last fall with some of the big fishery people, and they were saying that a lot of the there are a lot of different species that are moving north.
Yeah. They had a talk here at Parlor Talk in July, fisheries.
Yeah, that's outside of my expertise. I'm flood girl. Well, I think that's all I have for today.
I want to ask a question. I don't want to turn this into a political discussion. Because when politics and science collide, it can have very
I'm a climate
unfortunate.
scientist, hippie.
How receptive are the county government people to information like this? In other words, if you did this presentation for the county commissioners, are they even going to listen to you? Or do they take this seriously and want to try to find solutions?
Yeah. There were some folks from Carteret County at an abbreviated talk just focused on Down East a couple of months ago. And I don't know how it was received.
I just kind of,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just get the sense that, and I can understand it if you want $1 million home on Front Street, you don't want
Yeah.
to talk about stuff like this.
But I'm not talking, I mean, outside of this plot, I'm not talking about the future. Everything
It's
that I
right
showed
now.
was right now. You can't argue
Right.
with my numbers.
Well, and the insurance companies certainly believe the numbers.
Yeah.
That's why
Yeah.
that's forcing them.
So,
But 10 years ago, you used to hear about this, and
Yeah.
they would say, watch out, people, because this is coming our way.
yeah.
It's here now. And how many people were here a couple of years ago when the guy did the lecture, when he started out, he said, I don't have any good news. And I'm not sugarcoating. This is the way it is now.
Right.
Yeah, when we talked to the state, to the Coastal Resources Commission, the talk before this was led by Billy Sweet out of NOAA. So the person at NOAA that does all of the sea level rise projections. And he talked a lot about the science, about uncertainties, why we see different rates at different gauges. So I didn't have the hard job. What we came in with in this talk was, it doesn't matter what the future projections are, this is how much it's flooding now, and this is why, and this is how it's impacting people. So it doesn't matter that 2040 looks very different than 2020. 2020 is wrong on this chart in terms of capturing flood risk. And they were very receptive to that. At a county level, I can't tell you what Carteret County thinks, but they are getting some of this information about how frequently it's flooding. Same with the health departments, the water quality, municipal staff. We work closely with municipal staff in Carolina Beach and New Bern, and then in Down East, we've been working really hard with Karen, and through all these community conversations, just getting feedback about where people want to know more about why it's flooding and what they want to do about it. So we're trying to get the right people involved in the conversations to try to reduce this burden of sea level rise.
I have a friend that teaches a blue economy and sea level rising course at ECU at the community college and at Citadel. Would you be willing to share your slides with her? Because I think
Yeah, of
she would
course.
really like to help you get the word out.
Yeah, of course, anyone. And I don't know if we post the slides on the Parlor Talks afterwards, but I'm happy to.
I know that we have those, this will be posted, I don't know if the slides individually will be posted.
Yeah.
But you know, this is what these Parlor Talks are about, is talking about change and just talking about community and ways that we can get involved and just hearing voices, all different kinds of voices. So Katherine will be here for just a little bit afterwards if you have anything else to ask her or share with her. But we are so thankful that you came and that you came, Katherine, to visit with us and to share with us and to just enlighten us, I guess, with flooding and how that is being monitored here. And I think we've learned a lot through that. We have one more